It's 3 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon in downtown Spokane. And you're listening to KYRS Medical Lake and Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 on your FM dial. Coming to you now is Long Waves with Gary Krug. Today's episode, Free Speech, Hypocrisy, and Propaganda. Well, we've been hearing so much about free speech in the news lately. Thank you for joining me today. We're going to have to talk a lot about free speech and some of what's been going on around the Charlie Hebdo episode in Paris. So let's just start with this idea of free speech for a second. If you think about it historically, people never had free speech. Through most of civilization, people did not have free speech. You couldn't speak against the king or the queen. You couldn't speak against the powers that be. You couldn't blaspheme. You couldn't say things against the ruling religion. In other words, you couldn't say anything that had the possibility of having you run afoul of power. The idea that people have freedom of speech is a remarkably recent idea, and for the most part we can trace it back to the Enlightenment, so-called, and this liberal idea that emerged from the writings of people like Jeremy Bentham and Thomas Hobbes and Rousseau, John Locke, and others, that individuals, in order to pursue their own rational self-interest, had to be free to do so. And part of that was being able to have free speech. So we didn't have free speech, and then we kind of did, and now maybe we don't again. And I'll explain that in a minute. Even in the contemporary U.S., free speech is limited. You can't libel people. You can't slander people. Obscenity, indecency to be precise, can be legally regulated. And there are all kinds of time and place and manner limitations that are put on free speech. So, for example, yes, you have a right to say whatever you say, but you don't have a right to say it outside my bedroom window at 2 a.m. You may have a right to be in a public place, but you can't obstruct the sidewalk. You may have a valid right to say what you want to say, but putting it on a billboard across from a school might be inappropriate. So time, place, and manner are, even the more conservative Supreme Courts are generally pretty happy with. They understand the need for that. And there's also a thing called fighting words. Fighting words are an odd little bit of free speech. These are insulting words which, by their very utterance, inflict injury or tend to incite an immediate breach of the peace. You say something that a normal person would be immediately incited to have violence as a result. Those are fighting words. An interesting bit, there are two decisions around this that are kind of important. One is the Chaplinsky decision in 1942. Which says about free speech, quote, "It has been well observed that such utterances are no essential part of any exposition of ideas, and are of such slight social value as a step to truth that any benefit may be derived from them is clearly outweighed by the social interest in morality and order." Okay, so on the one hand we have this idea that whatever slight truth there may be in fighting words, there's an overweighing social interest in order and morality. And then we have Terminello versus Chicago in 1949, and they have a rather interesting different read. "The function of free speech," it starts, "under our system of government is to invite dispute. It may indeed best serve its high purpose when it induces a condition of unrest, creates dissatisfaction with conditions as they are, or even stirs people to anger. Speech is often provocative and challenging. It may strike at prejudices and preconceptions and have profound, unsettling effects as it presses for an acceptance of an idea. This is why freedom of speech, though not absolute, is nevertheless protected against censorship or punishment. That's from the Terminillo decision. So on the one hand, the courts have argued that free speech doesn't cover provocative words that might incite people to anger or violence. And on the other hand, we have a Supreme Court saying, well, no, actually, the value of free speech is the most important part. And all this comes to a head in the Charlie Hebdo incident. So on the one hand, we have this idea, which the Terminillo versus Chicago decision states expressly, that the values of a liberal Western society dictate the judgments to be made in free speech. And that's reasonable. It's us making the judgments. We have our own history and background and values. But to suggest that the values of the U.S. should apply to the whole world is an enormous step forward, or backwards, depending on how you want to phrase it. And it also suggests that our system is the Western system is somehow completely applicable in all situations, which it's plainly not. Jiwan Kistri was writing this week on the Saker of the Vineyard blog, put it thusly: apparently, every contentious issue in the world today has to be settled according to the so-called Western values, the mutated offspring of the European Enlightenment. The God of reason being the God of all gods. Can the Muslims statistically prove that drawing horrid images of the Prophet are blasphemous? No. Can they prove in the laboratory that it is blasphemous to depict the Prophet in a particular way? No. How could they possibly quantify blasphemy and assign a specific score for each of the potentially blasphemous acts? They cannot do that. It is in this basis that the enlightened European cartoonists gleefully draw those cartoons offending no less than 1 billion people worldwide. No less than 1 billion people worldwide. Now, we always end up paying for free speech. And we generally pay for it in advance, in that we must allow other voices to speak that we don't agree with nor like, and they get to speak opinions that we do not subscribe to and really would not like to see happen. That's the idea. And the idea, of course, is that free speech should be not coerced. Free speech should not be distorted, especially when it's speech around issues like news. Yet we censor and criminalize an enormous number of people in the United States and have for years. If you go back to Eugene Debs, who was imprisoned under the Alien and Sedition Act for arguing that World War I was unjust, a war not of America, but a war of plutocrats, the owners of the country, and arguing against the war openly and suggesting people should not enroll in the draft, that they shouldn't participate in the war. This got him locked up in Club Fed. But we continue to do just those sorts of things, and worse, even today. Only now it's not the socialists or the unionists we're after, the government is after. It's people from the Middle East. Glenn Greenwald, writing on Salon back in 2012, compiled a nice, frightening list of what's happened to some people in America, the land of the free. Meher Arar, a Canadian Syrian citizen, was abducted by the U.S. government in September 2002 at JFK Airport in New York. So he was held for 2 weeks in the U.S. in solitary confinement and denied access to a lawyer by the U.S. Then they decided to render him, not back to Canada, but to Syria, a place he hadn't lived in for 15 years. He's imprisoned in Syria for the next year, 10 months of which is in solitary confinement. The U.S. knew it would happen, but he was continuously interrogated, beaten, and tortured. And because he wasn't involved in terror and had nothing to tell his torturers, so they tend to beat you more in those situations. Then the Syrians concluded he was innocent, and they sent him back to Canada. Canada apologized, gave him a stack of money, but no such justice in the United States. The Bush and Obama DOJ, quoting Greenwald here, the Bush and Obama DOJ both insisted that following Arar's claims to be heard in the U.S. would risk disclosure of vital state secrets. Vital state secrets. That's always the card that gets played whenever you want to do something horrible to anyone that might have offended the current powers that be. We have another case, Tariq Ramadan, highly regarded professor of contemporary Islamic studies at Oxford, one of the most accomplished scholars in his field, according to Greenwald. For 6 years, he's banned from entering the U.S., and in 2004, he had accepted a tenured position at Notre Dame. But he was forced to resign. This is in 2004. This is when his 6-year ban starts. He was forced to resign when 9 days before they were moving to Indiana, he and his family, his visa suddenly gets revoked by the State Department, citing an ideological exclusion provision of the Patriot Act. Now, Ramadan had been an outspoken critic of violence carried out by Muslims against civilians in the name of the Quran, but he was also a vigorous, quoting Greenwald, a vigorous opponent of violence carried out by the U.S. government in the Muslim world. For the latter act, he was accused by the United States government with no charges or trial of being a terrorist sympathizer and a threat to national security. Or take the case of Dr. Sami al-Aryan, a Palestinian, whose ongoing persecution by the U.S. government, Greenwald writes, is one of the most repellent and unjust of any in the post-9/11 era. In 2003, while working as an engineering professor at the University of South Florida, he was indicted by the Ashcroft Department of Justice on multiple counts of material support for terrorism. Well, what was his material support for terrorism? Well, let's see, he was an outspoken advocate for Palestinians. He opposed the Israeli occupation of Palestine and Gaza. The U.S. government had monitored all of his telephone communications for 10 years, yet they hadn't found any evidence that he was involved in any sort of plot, that he was involved in any sort of act of terror. They claimed that he was supporting Islamic Jihad, a Palestinian group that's focused on the Israel-Palestinian dispute. But they hold him for 3 years in solitary confinement while he's waiting for his trial, okay? Finally gets his trial in 2006. And for evidence against him, the government gave his speeches, a list of the books he'd read, the websites he'd visited, the magazines he edited, and the rallies he attended. So he was basically prosecuted for his political views and for his free speech, his political speech. They couldn't come up with a shred of evidence that he was involved in any act of terrorism or plotting or supporting terrorism or any of this nonsense. It's simply that he had political views and activities that they decided they weren't going to have. Central Florida jury acquitted him on half of the counts and deadlocked on the other half. 10 of the 12 jurors wanted to acquit on all charges. That in itself is unusual in the U.S. But rather than going through a whole new trial again, which if he's found guilty on anything can send him to prison for the rest of his life, he pleads guilty to one count of, quote, contributing services for the benefit of a designated terrorist group. So the federal judge presiding over the case disregarded the prosecutor's sentencing recommendations and sentenced him to a longer prison term than what the plea agreement called for, the maximum permitted by law. And this guy's problems don't stop here. Dr. Al-Arian's problems continue. Prison sentence ends in 2007, and he was supposed to be deported. Yet Al-Arian was never released from prison. 9 years later, when the article was written, he still was not free, and nothing was moving forward in his case at all. This is free speech in the belly of the empire. Have all the free speech you want, as long as you're not Muslim, as long as you're not saying anything political against any of the darlings of the U.S. And we can also forget the overt acts of terrorism committed by this government and its friends, which we are all, of course, encouraged to support in full-throated acclamation. And so it goes. James Yee, the Muslim chaplain at Guantanamo, 2003, he complains about how the detainees are being treated. So what do? We arrest him. The government arrests him, charges him with sedition and espionage, and puts him into extreme solitary confinement. They put him into exactly the same conditions that the people were in at Guantanamo. And then, when the whimsy took them, the military just decided to drop all the charges. But so much for getting an apology, or much less getting compensation. And how do you compensate someone after you've held them in intense solitary confinement and essentially ruin their lives? How do you make that up? And we're not even decent enough to say sorry? It's shaming. Or take the case of Stephen Salita. Stephen Salita was a university professor who had been appointed to a position at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. But the Board of Trustees pulled his nomination, his job, after he had been critical on his private Twitter about Israel. So Professor Salita quits his job, is all ready to move to Illinois, and then the word gets out somehow that he's tweeted some extremely unfavorable things about Israel, and some even inflammatory things about Israel. And what happens is mail starts coming in from donors, primarily Jewish donors, to the university, saying they'll pull their money unless the university gets rid of this guy. Free speech? Not so much. Within a liberal culture, within a Western liberal culture, we must hear ideas we don't agree with. But as I said before, our standards are not the world's standards, and neither can we make a case for our standards or values when we violate them with such staggering frequency whenever it serves the national purpose. Announced since the Charlie Hebdo episode and all of the pompousness of national leaders coming out and showing their support for free speech. Well, France has taken advantage of the opportunity and this week has opened over 50 cases of condoning terrorism, arresting a comedian, sometimes politician, for posting things on Facebook that were critical. So, Charlie Hebdo, look how much we love the free speech. We will let you say anything bad you want to say about Muslims. But don't you dare say anything bad about the French government or the American government or the powers that be. And this is what we ought to be teaching in kindergarten, if we want kids to really get how the world works. So what was all the outrage about Charlie Hebdo about? So we have this one event which rises to the level of theatric outrage, and the world leaders transform the event into a cause célèbre. It's the thing they all show up and they give their little talks and appear on the podium and look all supportive of something. But why that event? Why is that the one that alarmed them so much? There were a lot of things going on in the world that week that people could have taken an interest in. The shelling of Donetsk, for example, by Ukrainian forces, which killed more than 20 people in one artillery shell attack hit on a bus, a civilian bus. I mean, that should have made some news. That's something to be outraged about. So what, je suis Ukraine? Why Paris? Why Paris? Is the fact that it happened in Paris, the city of beauty, city of lights? Well, Paris is no stranger to violence, revolution, riots, and it's no stranger to oppression and inequality. Paris is, by some accounts, 10 to 15% Muslim. And this is a legacy of centuries of colonialism in places like Algeria, where the French were utterly ruthless in the suppression of local people and their politics. So maybe, why Paris? Well, we'll get to that. London, similar to Paris, 8 to 13% Muslim. Now, if you look at this, if you really want to get a snapshot of life for Muslim people, for Muslim youth in particular, in places like Paris, see a movie called La Haine, Hate. It's a lovely study of the lives of 3 young men. Most of them are unemployed. Most of them have no hope of change, no hope of education. Many live in poverty. Why the outrage about Paris? Why Charlie? And why now? Well, is it possible? Can any event, especially a shocking one, after all we know about how the world works, can any shocking event be accepted at face value in the news? Are events not commonly created and manipulated to make political hay? And hasn't this proven remarkably effective in manipulating politicians, into manipulating populations, into surrendering their own rights to militaries and to government spy agencies? Hasn't the manipulation of news events, the sowing of fear and otherness and hate, haven't these things been remarkably effective at bringing about these rising nationalist and neo-Nazi and racist parties, not just in the U.S., but in England, in France, in Ukraine, in Greece? We could make a good case that the CIA has manipulated news repeatedly throughout their history. They did it about leftist terrorism in the 60s and 70s to blame Russia for European and Middle Eastern acts of violence. And there were people in the room who said, we tried to tell Casey that all the things he thought were Russian conspiracies were things that the CIA invented out of whole cloth and planted into European newspapers. We know this. There's strong evidence, including first-hand accounts, that the United States Office of Special Services, the forerunner to the CIA, recruited Nazis after World War II, and in the final days of World War II, to secretly help them root out and kill folks who might prove to be communist or Russian sympathizers. Oh my goodness. And of course, this nonsense continues today. Look at Ukraine. Look at Afghanistan, Iraq, the decades of wars in Central and South America. We know that our government in the U.S. subverted the news, bought journalists, planted stories, traded favors with editors and journalists. So should we really be surprised at any story that's shocking and horrifying and we're told about yet another atrocity? And should we believe it? And should we believe what we're supposed to think about it? It's that last bit that's especially important. What are we supposed to think about the Charlie Hebdo incident? Why is the event important? We cannot attribute this burst of importance to some intrinsic characteristic of the event. But we do need to consider that the way it was treated in the media is interesting. The worldview, the ideology, the perceived interests of owners and editors hugely affects content. Duh. I mean, we know this. And we know that our government, as I said before, particularly the U.S. government, plants false stories, uses dupes, pays reporters, has armies of paid experts to advance U.S. government interests on TV and interviews, writing op-eds. The U.S. interests, such as creating threats and enemies, whenever empire wishes to advance its control and power. This is what they sell. And it's pretty effective the way they do it. Saker of the Vineyard, writing on his blog, had the following observation. We've already seen all that. On 9/11, the American people were literally conditioned to react with fear and hysteria. It worked perfectly, and we all know how that ended, with many major wars and millions Iraq people dead. Most Americans simply stopped thinking and substituted a panic reaction to careful analysis. Today, Europe is doing exactly the same thing. The same causes will yield the same results. Will we ever learn? And I said a moment ago that France is already enacting draconian laws that you can be aiding terrorists just for saying the wrong thing on a Facebook page. So who is the enemy anyway? Sure, they're kind of oblique about it. Saker continues, they say, we are not against Islam. Islam is a religion of peace. We have nothing against the Muslims. The truth is, continuing to quote, the truth is, while they have nothing against Islam and good Muslims, they also just happen to think that multiculturalism has failed, and that, quote, Islam is incompatible with Western societies. Not only that, but since bad Muslims tend to hide amongst good Muslims, let's just stay on the safe side and keep a very, very close eye on all them Muslims, just in case one of them happened to suddenly turn into a crazed jihadi suicide bomber, right? Did you notice, this is still Saker, did you notice how all these takfiri freaks just happen to have plenty of contacts of all sorts with Western security services? I'll explain. Takfiri is an Arabic word. It's a Muslim who denounces other Muslims as not being Muslim. Takfiri. So Saker notices that all of these takfiris who go out and do these acts all seem to have excellent contacts with Western security services. Quote, it's like a Ku Klux Klan meeting in the USA. For 10 hooded participants, you have 2 morons and 8 federal agents working undercover. Same exact deal for these takfiris. And when the two morons do something really bad and the 8 federal agents just happen to vanish in thin air or commit suicide, does that have anything to do with Islam? Of course not. It has everything to do with the deep state and the covert manipulation of probably every single terrorist group on the planet. So what would make more sense? To fear Muslims or the Western security services, which carefully manipulate them? So while we are busy hunting down those evil Muslims, they can continue to exploit us all. They seek to create an atmosphere of social chaos, civil strife, and civil war. And we know how this works, right? It's so power can continue to exploit all of us. Christians, Jews, Muslims, Arabs, Caucasians. Anywhere there's a division among us, between us, power drives in a wedge. Power drives a wedge into all divisions. And it is plain that the whole Charlie Hebdo episode is useful to Western policies. And so all of their statements about all of their great love of free speech and great love of democratic processes stinks of hypocrisy. I mean, the U.S. State Department was saying it's all about free speech. U.S. State Department Deputy Spokesperson Marie Harf said, and I quote, "Regardless of what anyone's personal opinion is, and I know there are very heated personal opinions about this, we absolutely support the right of Charlie Hebdo to publish things like this. Again, that's what happens in a democracy, period." She goes on to say, "I think we should broadly call on news organizations to take into account the factors that they think are important. There are a variety of factors, I'm sure, that go into decisions to publish, whether it's journalistic freedom, whether it's sensitivity, religious sensitivity, which I understand. I understand how important it is to many people. That never justifies violence or hatred. There's a variety of factors that go into the publication's decision to do this, and we absolutely support the right of these organizations to publish freely, period." Well, okay, that's your usual B-flat sort of State Department drivel. And look at how they distance themselves. Here's this happy moment that just occurred and just happens to benefit the United States and its efforts hugely. It steps on the feet of the French, who were beginning to lean perhaps a little more toward Russia in some issues going down in Europe. And so, it's all about free speech. They should publish whatever they want. Absolutely. Meanwhile, if you do that here, we'll lock you up and put you in prison. Charge you with sedition or trading with the enemies or some other made-up law. But we'll still sing the praises of free speech because we're a free and democratic country. And we all know that. Charlie Hebdo is not this cutting-edge document of political freedom that the mainstream news have seemed to try and create them into. Moon of Alabama noted on their blog, quote, "The whole political outrage over free speech, in this case, is completely made up. There's no free speech in France or elsewhere in Europe or in the United States. Most states have blasphemy and lèse-majesté laws. Additionally, social laws are effectively in place against other speech issues. Just try to make a few public points about the racist colonizations project of some East Europeans in West Asia and see the reaction." Hebdo Charles itself fired one of its own writers for alleged anti-Semitism. A court ruled the writer was unlawfully terminated without a sane reason. But then we have all of the reaction of the powers that be. I mean, they can't possibly let a good disaster go by unused. Again from Moon of Alabama, quote, thousands of people take part in a silent march in Paris in remembrance of the victims of last week's attacks in France. The attacks by a bunch of criminals were depicted as an assault on free speech. Unfortunately, a bunch of hypocrites invited by French President Hollande insisted on walking at the front of the march and to devalue the intended purpose. Many of the leaders sowed and saw terror in their own and other countries. As one Charlie Hebdo cartoonist says, quote, we vomit on all these people who suddenly say they are our friends. Dick Wickham documented the free speech credentials of these so-called leaders who now compel the participants of the march to follow in the stench of their hypocrisy. Well, there's a few more issues we need to dig into here a bit. Why attack this insignificant little newspaper in Paris? Now, if you really wanted to attack someone to avenge the prophet or to strike back at empires, why would you go after this little paper with a print run of, 30,000 or so? It doesn't make good sense. But President Francois Hollande says that the attack was, without a doubt, an act of terrorism. So let's raise the entire national terrorist status to its highest level. We got MI5 as well screaming about, the major widespread terrorist attacks going to happen in London. The U.S. has kicked its security up to Paisley, and it just gets weirder and weirder. Tony Carlucci, writing at The Land Destroyer, says, however, despite Hollande's feigned concern and outrage over the attack, it was the French government who had advocated and presided over the arming of the terrorist groups across the Arab world in the West's bid to overthrow nation after nation and reorder the entire region according to their own geopolitical and economic interest, starting with the Arab Spring in 2011. Continuing with the quote, French complicity in arming militants in Syria especially has long been a point of contention and fear among critics who have warned for years about blowback. However, it is unlikely that France or its partners amongst this vast network of state-sponsored global terror did not anticipate such blowback and were somehow unable to prevent such attacks if desired. In other words, what the attacks in Paris appear to be is another of NATO's Operation Gladio-style attacks on the European people in an insidious bid to manipulate public perception as well as the regional political landscape. And I'll read you another passage here that explains a little bit what he meant by the Operation Gladio-style attacks. Funded by the U.S., trained in Britain, and maintained as paramilitary extremist groups throughout Europe during the Cold War, NATO's so-called stay-behind networks were supposedly created to activate in the wake of a full-scale Soviet invasion of Western Europe. Instead, they were used to stage false flag attacks, killing and maiming hundreds of Europeans, with their atrocities blamed on the Soviet Union and their European sympathizers. The attacks and assassinations were used by NATO to manipulate public perception and reverse gains by political groups operating beyond NATO's control. It makes perfect sense. And it is a set of operations that are extremely well documented. So if you want to know more about Gladio, look into it yourself and check out Sibel Edmonds' Boiling Frogs post as a good place to start. So anyway, Charlie Hebdo, we see the leaders of the West, the leaders of Europe, weeping crocodile tears in Paris and eviscerating, the right wing eviscerating Obama for not playing his part in that charade. Hypocrisy steeped on hypocrisy. John White, writing for Counterpoint, observes the following: watching the leaders of governments, which, between them, have been responsible for carnage and mayhem on a grand scale, the likes of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, for example, leading a march against terrorism and extremism, qualified not so much as the theater of the absurd, but as the theater of the grotesque. Imposters at an event that millions of people allowed themselves to hope would mark a step change in a world scarred by war, barbarism, and injustice. Je suis Charlie, I am Charlie, describes the delimitation of our solidarity with all victims of extremism and barbarism. It allows us to avoid confronting the ugly truth of our culpability in the fate of those victims. When Aimé Césaire warned that a civilization which justifies colonization and therefore force is already a sick civilization, a civilization which is morally diseased, which is irresistibly progressing from one consequence to another, one denial to another, calls for its Hitler. I mean its punishment. He was talking to us. Some things we're not supposed to talk about. And if you're the wrong color or the wrong political persuasion or the wrong religion in this country, you already know that without me saying it. But let's just look at the free speech here. Westboro Baptist Church, on the road again, shows up in Portland, and are going to do their usual God hates fags stuff. And the good citizens are taking this to Portland. Really, have they never seen Portlandia? It's hard to imagine. Anyway, so they show up and they're met with signs saying things like, dog hates dyslexia, God hates figs. They're basically shotted down. And this is a case where there was a denial of free speech of Westboro Baptist Church as an assertion of free speech. And sometimes we can assert free speech that denies others free speech, which is exactly what happens in Portland. And as I said at the beginning of the show, we always pay for free speech. We pay for it in advance, in our having to hear the ideas of those with whom we have no agreement or even common cause beyond our common humanity. And maybe that ought to be common cause enough for most things. There are events that should outrage us, no question. And the first of these events, though, should be the manipulation of the news, the lying to the public, the use of fear and coercion and a militarized police force and border patrol to suppress and terrorize one's own citizens. This should be the first cause of outrage. The censoring internally of ideas and persons, the condemnation of people for their thoughts. For their thoughts. Thought crimes. We're there. And we should reject the cynical hypocrisy that leads us to anger or fear of the wrong events and the wrong people. Lies and manipulations of the news and events of the world divide us. We are allowed, heck, we are encouraged to defame the government's enemies. And we are defended in this through our rights of free speech, so-called. Yet, we must not be anti-Semitic. I mean, Louis Gohmert himself, would have us as enemies of the state if we didn't defend Israel, which his Bible tells him is doing God's work and fulfilling prophecy, and we must follow Israel's lead. Oh, Louis. Another gift from Texas. But when we limit free speech, often, it denies free speech to the least among us, to the people who can't speak out, who won't be heard, who are already marginalized as unclean or unworthy or undeserving of rights. These are the first people we deny speech to, and there is a grave danger here. But there is also a hypocrisy in crying out that we support free speech as a principle in some cases, and we condemn people for free speech in others. Je suis Charlie. It's always easy to put on a T-shirt and feel you've made a political statement. Mais non, je suis Ukraine. Je suis Gaza. I'm Chelsea Manning. If I wanted to make a statement about free speech, I would say, I am Chelsea Manning. I am a person who sacrificed, who broke laws to bring important truths to the world and to the American people. If I wanted to support free speech, I would say, I am Julian Assange, who with WikiLeaks brought the dark, nasty secrets of the daily conduct of the U.S. wars of aggression to the world. If I wanted to support free speech, I would say, I'm Snowden, who again sacrificed, broke laws to bring truth to the American people and the world, a truth that revealed beyond any question that we were being systematically lied to, and that our government was being lied to by the intelligence agencies. Who am I? Je suis Charlie? No. I am those who suffer for telling the truth about empire. I am those who languish without charge in Guantanamo. I am those who are killed indiscriminately with drones and bombs. I am the Syrian civilians. God sent me. The greatest threat to free speech isn't Muslim extremists. It's our own governments. It's any power that disdains or fears its people. Any government that must lie and imprison thought crimes to maintain its power. Maybe it's time to think back to Walt Kelly's great comic Pogo and remember that brilliant observation by Pogo. We have met the enemy, and he is us. And that's the end of today's show on Long Waves. Thank you so much for listening. You can write me at longwaves@kyrs.org. You can follow the show on Facebook. I post some of the readings, and I also post links to podcasts of the shows on Facebook, Long Waves Radio. So until next week, I wish you a very good week and hope that all goes well for you. Thanks for listening.